A racist cop spits on a black man, only to regret it later. What he didn't know was that the man he humiliated was the newly appointed chief of police. What followed shook not just the precinct, but the entire community, forcing everyone to confront the toxic culture they had ignored for too long. Have you ever faced blatant disrespect like this or witnessed someone being humiliated without a way to respond? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to share where you're watching from. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you don't miss more inspiring stories like this one. Richard Miller stepped out of his car, his polished black boots crunching against the gravel of the precinct's parking lot. His clothes were deliberately nondescript, a plaid shirt, faded jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low over his brow. To the casual observer, he was just another face in the crowd, a man running errands or perhaps visiting someone inside. But this unassuming figure was anything but ordinary. Richard Miller had just been appointed chief of police for Blue Ridge, a department mired in whispers of corruption and accusations of misconduct. His mission was as clear as it was daunting: root out the rot, rebuild trust, and transform the precinct into a symbol of justice. Richard adjusted his cap and surveyed the bustling lot. Officers came and went, some chatting in small groups, others absorbed in their phones or notes. The atmosphere was casual, almost jovial, yet beneath the surface lay an undercurrent of tension. He could feel it, the quiet camaraderie of those who'd grown too comfortable in their ways, the unspoken hierarchy that protected some while ostracizing others. This was a culture he'd encountered before in his 2 decades of service. But here, the stakes felt higher. Blue Ridge wasn't just another precinct. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Walking toward the side entrance, Richard kept his stride deliberate, unhurried. He'd chosen not to announce his arrival publicly, opting instead to observe his new department through an unfiltered lens. Public ceremonies and press conferences could wait. For now, he wanted to see the raw reality, to understand the people behind the badges, without the veneer of professionalism they would undoubtedly put on if they knew who he was. The precinct's interior was a cacophony of sounds: ringing phones, the clatter of keyboards, bursts of laughter from unseen corners. The air was thick with the scent of coffee, stale but strong, mingling with the faint tang of industrial cleaner. Richard moved slowly, his eyes scanning the room. Clusters of officers were gathered near desks, some engrossed in paperwork, others swapping stories with exaggerated gestures. A few glanced at him, their eyes flickering with brief curiosity before returning to their conversations. No one stopped him. No one asked who he was or why he was there. This was exactly what he wanted. The anonymity allowed him to observe without interference. He noted the dynamics, the way some officers seemed to dominate the conversations while others hung back, the subtle body language that revealed alliances and divisions. It was a microcosm of the larger issues he suspected plagued the department: cliques, unchecked egos, and a lack of accountability. Richard's heart was steady, but his mind raced. He had read the reports, the complaints filed by civilians, and even by some officers within the department. Excessive force, discriminatory behavior, a culture of silence that protected the perpetrators while silencing the victims. He'd seen it all before, but knowing it and witnessing it firsthand were two different things. Now, standing in the heart of it, he felt the weight of the challenge ahead pressing down on him. As he moved toward the break room, a burst of laughter erupted from a group of officers gathered near a desk. Their voices carried easily across the space. "Another one of those reports came in," one of them said, his tone dismissive. "You know how these people are, always looking for something to complain about." Richard's jaw tightened. He didn't need to hear more to understand the sentiment. This was the kind of attitude that eroded trust between law enforcement and the community, a dismissiveness that turned genuine concerns into jokes. He clenched his fists briefly, forcing himself to remain composed. This wasn't the time to intervene, not yet. The sound of heavy boots echoed behind him. "Hey, you!" The voice was sharp, authoritative, cutting through the ambient noise like a whip. Richard turned slowly, his face impassive. A white officer approached him, his expression a mix of irritation and smugness. His badge read, "Daniels." "Who the hell are you? And what are you doing here?" Daniels demanded, his tone dripping with condescension. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but Daniels waved a hand dismissively. "Never mind. Lost, aren't you? This isn't a shelter. You need to move along." His words were loud, designed for the benefit of the nearby officers who had stopped to watch. A few chuckled, their amusement evident. Richard held his ground, his eyes locked on Daniels. "I'm just passing through," he said evenly, his voice calm but firm. Daniels took a step closer, his grin widening. "Passing through, huh? Well, let me save you some time. You don't belong here. People like you never do. The laughter from the onlookers grew louder, emboldened by Daniel's performance. Richard said nothing. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through him, his pulse quickening. Every instinct told him to confront the man, to shut down his arrogance with a single devastating revelation, but he resisted. This wasn't the moment for that, not yet. Instead, he turned and walked away, his movements deliberate, his back straight. The laughter faded behind him, replaced by the low hum of resumed conversations. As he approached the main hallway, the intercom crackled to life. All personnel, report to the briefing room immediately. Richard paused, letting out a slow breath. The time for observation was over. Now, it was time to act. Richard hadn't made it far down the hallway when the sound of heavy footsteps behind him made him pause. "Hey, you!" The voice was sharp, cutting through the low hum of the precinct. Turning slowly, Richard found himself face to face with a tall, broad-shouldered officer whose badge read Daniels. His stance radiated arrogance, his smirk curling as if he'd already decided Richard wasn't worth his time. "You lost or something?" Daniels asked, his tone laced with mockery. His gaze swept over Richard's scuffed sneakers, worn jeans and plaid shirt, lingering with exaggerated disdain. "This isn't a drop-in center. You don't belong here." Richard met his gaze, calm but unyielding. "I'm not lost," he replied evenly. Daniels tilted his head, his grin widening. "Then why are you standing in my precinct like you own the place?" His words dripped with condescension. The exchange had caught the attention of a few nearby officers, who leaned against desks and walls, watching with barely concealed amusement. Richard's silence seemed to irritate Daniels further. He took a step closer, his voice louder now, ensuring everyone could hear. "Let me guess, you're here to file some complaint, right? Maybe about how the system's unfair, or how we're not doing enough for people like you." The subtle emphasis on "people like you" wasn't lost on Richard. His jaw tightened, but his expression remained composed. He had encountered men like Daniels before, men who wielded their authority like a weapon, their prejudices thinly veiled behind a badge. "Do you treat everyone this way?" Richard asked, his tone calm but sharp enough to cut through the room's growing tension. Daniels let out a laugh, stepping even closer. "Only the ones who don't belong," he sneered. "And from where I'm standing, you're as out of place as a fish in the desert." The small group of onlookers chuckled, some openly grinning as if this was a routine performance. One officer leaned back against a desk, crossing his arms with a smirk. Another muttered something to his colleague, prompting a burst of laughter. Richard held his ground, his calm demeanor an unsettling contrast to Daniels' escalating hostility. But then Daniels took it further. Without warning, Daniels spat. The wet impact landed on Richard's cheek, the warm saliva sliding down his skin. For a moment, the room fell silent. The laughter died, replaced by the sound of a chair scraping against the floor as one officer shifted uncomfortably. Richard didn't flinch. His breath hitched briefly, but he quickly reached into his pocket, pulling out a handkerchief. He wiped his face with deliberate care, folding the cloth neatly before tucking it back into his pocket. Around him, the silence stretched, thick with anticipation. The officers were waiting for him to explode, to retaliate, to give Daniels the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. Instead, Richard fixed his gaze on Daniels. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through those doors?" he asked, his voice steady, but carrying an edge of steel. Daniels smirked again, though it faltered slightly under Richard's unwavering stare. "Only the ones who don't belong," he repeated, his bravado slipping into something more defensive. Richard said nothing in response. His eyes swept briefly over the other officers, noting the mixture of amusement, discomfort, and indifference in their expressions. Then, with a quiet dignity that stood in stark contrast to Daniel's behavior, he turned and walked away. The laughter resumed behind him, though it was quieter this time, more uncertain. "Guess he didn't have much to say after all," one of the officers muttered, eliciting a few half-hearted chuckles. Daniels, however, remained rooted to the spot, his smirk returning as he watched Richard disappear down the hallway. "Probably thought he could waltz in here and, what? Get a tour?" he scoffed, shaking his head. But Daniels didn't know the truth. None of them did. The man they had just insulted wasn't a lost civilian or a powerless visitor. He was their new chief of police, and the reckoning he would bring was already underway. Unaware of the storm they had just unleashed, Daniels and his colleagues laughed, oblivious to the seismic shift that was about to shake the very foundation of the precinct. The briefing room buzzed with muted chatter as officers filed in, some holding steaming coffee mugs, others cracking jokes to lighten the morning mood. At the front, Captain Harris, a stout man with a graying mustache, adjusted his tie, glancing at the clock. The intercom announcement had summoned everyone, and curiosity filled the air. The precinct had been leaderless for weeks, and now, at last, the new chief was about to make his introduction. Richard Miller stepped in through a side door, his movements measured, deliberate. A leather folder embossed with the precinct's insignia rested in his hand. As he strode to the podium, his eyes scanned the room, taking in every face, some attentive, others indifferent. Then, his gaze landed on Daniels, who was leaning casually against the wall at the back of the room. The moment their eyes met, Daniels' smug grin faltered, and his face drained of color. The room fell silent as Harris cleared his throat. "All right, settle down, everyone," he began. "As you know, Chief Caldwell retired last month, and we've been waiting for his replacement. I'm pleased to introduce your new Chief of Police, Richard Miller. He comes to us with an impeccable record and a vision to lead this department forward." The officers turned their attention to the man at the podium. Richard set the folder down, opened it, and took a brief moment to look out over the room. He could feel the tension, the guarded stares, and the skepticism emanating from certain corners. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his arms crossed, his earlier confidence evaporated. "Good morning," Richard began, his voice calm but commanding. "My name is Richard Miller, and as of today, I am your new Chief of Police." His words carried weight, cutting through the silence like a knife. Murmurs rippled through the room. A few officers exchanged uneasy glances, while others sat stiffly, their expressions carefully neutral. Daniels looked down, avoiding eye contact. Richard continued, his tone steady. "This morning, I arrived early and walked through these halls in plain clothes. I wanted to see the department as it truly is, not through the filter of polished presentations or rehearsed welcomes. What I witnessed was both enlightening and troubling." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The officers were riveted now, the air thick with tension. "I saw a culture that tolerates disrespect and dismissiveness. A culture where belittling others isn't just accepted, it's encouraged. Let me be clear, that ends today." A murmur of discomfort spread through the crowd. Richard raised a hand, silencing it. "As law enforcement officers, we carry the responsibility of protecting and serving our community. That requires respect, not just for the people we serve, but for each other. Without respect, we fail, not just as officers, but as human beings." Daniels squirmed, his discomfort palpable. Beads of sweat formed on his brow as Richard's gaze lingered on him for a moment, before sweeping across the room. Before Richard could continue, a voice from the middle of the room cut through the tension. "With all due respect, Chief," said Officer Steve Carter, a burly, seasoned officer with over 20 years on the force. "You've been here for what? Half a day. And now you're telling us how we should run our department?" The room held its collective breath. Carter's words were blunt, his tone bordering on defiant. A few officers nodded subtly, emboldened by his challenge. Richard met Carter's gaze, unflinching. "You're right, Officer Carter. I've been here less than a day," he acknowledged. "But it didn't take long to see that this department has a problem that goes beyond individual incidents. It's systemic, ingrained, and if left unchecked, it will continue to erode the trust this community has in us." Carter leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "And you think you can fix that overnight?" "No," Richard replied, his voice unwavering. "Change doesn't happen overnight. It requires hard work, accountability, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But it starts with leadership. It starts with setting a standard and holding people to it." "Easy to say," Carter shot back, "but this job isn't about words, it's about actions." Richard stepped away from the podium, his eyes locked on Carter. "Exactly. And my actions began this morning, when I witnessed behavior that has no place in this department." The room grew colder as Richard turned his attention to Daniels. "Officer Daniels," he said, his voice slicing through the air, "your conduct this morning was unacceptable. You not only disrespected me, but you disrespected the badge and the values it represents." Daniels opened his mouth to speak, but Richard didn't give him the chance. "Effective immediately, you are suspended pending an internal investigation into your conduct. And let me be clear, this isn't a slap on the wrist. This is the beginning of a broader effort to address the culture that has been allowed to fester here." Gasps rippled through the room. Daniel's face turned a deep shade of crimson, his jaw tightening as he looked down at the floor. Carter, visibly taken aback, remained silent, his earlier bravado tempered by the gravity of Richard's words. Richard returned to the podium, his voice rising slightly as he addressed the entire room. "This is not about punishment. It's about accountability. It's about setting a standard that will define this department moving forward. If you cannot meet that standard, this is not the place for you. He let the silence hang for a moment, his gaze sweeping across the room, meeting the eyes of each officer. But for those of you who are ready to rise to the challenge, who are ready to do better and be better, I promise you this: I will stand with you. I will lead by example, and together, we will rebuild the trust that this community has lost. The room remained silent, the weight of Richard's declaration pressing down on everyone present. Slowly, officers began to shift in their seats, some nodding subtly, others avoiding his gaze entirely. As the meeting concluded, Richard stepped down from the podium and watched as the officers filed out. Some avoided him entirely, their expressions a mix of guilt and unease. Others nodded politely, though their faces betrayed lingering doubt. Daniels stormed out without a word, his fists clenched, his face a mixture of humiliation and anger. Carter lingered for a moment, his expression unreadable, before finally leaving the room. The day after the confrontation in the briefing room, the precinct buzzed with quiet murmurs. Officer Mark Daniels, now officially suspended, was absent from his usual spot in the back corner. The news of his suspension had spread quickly, creating an undeniable tension within the department. While some officers respected the decision, others viewed it as an overreach. At the center of the discontent stood Officer Steve Carter, whose long tenure and deep connections within the precinct gave him influence over many. Richard sat at his desk, reviewing Daniels's personnel file. It was a troubling read. Complaints ranging from inappropriate remarks to excessive force, all buried or dismissed by prior leadership. He'd seen similar patterns in other departments: misconduct ignored, records sanitized, and a culture of impunity allowed to flourish. But here, Richard intended to break that cycle. When Captain Harris entered the office, Richard didn't look up. "Captain, I want a full review of every complaint against Daniels," Richard said firmly. "I want names, dates, and outcomes. If anything was overlooked, I want to know why." Harris hesitated, shifting his weight. "Chief, you're stirring up a hornet's nest," he warned. "Daniels isn't just a lone wolf. He's got friends here, and they won't take this lying down." Richard finally looked up, his expression unflinching. "Then let them stand. If they're complicit, they'll answer for it too." The backlash began almost immediately. Carter, emboldened by his years of camaraderie with the old guard, made no effort to hide his dissatisfaction. In the break room, he addressed a small group of officers, his voice dripping with disdain. "You all see what's happening, don't you?" Carter said, gesturing broadly. "This guy's been here, 2 days? And suddenly he thinks he's got the whole place figured out. Daniels was one of the best. Sure, he's rough around the edges, but who here isn't? Now we're throwing guys under the bus for doing their jobs?" One officer nodded in agreement, muttering, "It's like he's out to make an example of us." "Exactly," Carter continued, his tone growing sharper. "This isn't about fixing anything. This is about power. He's here to tear us down, not build us up." From the corner of the room, Officer Maria Reyes, a younger recruit, spoke up hesitantly. "But Carter," Daniels spit in his face, "you really think that's defensible?" Carter's eyes narrowed. "Watch yourself, Reyes. You're new here. You don't know how things work yet." Reyes shrank back, her face flushing, but she didn't respond further. The group fell into uneasy silence, Carter's dominance stifling any dissent. Later that day, Richard gathered the department's leadership team for a meeting. As the officers filed in, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Carter entered last, his movements deliberate, and took a seat near the back. "Let's get straight to it," Richard began, his tone direct. "I've initiated an internal investigation into Officer Daniels' conduct. But this isn't just about one individual. This is about the culture we've allowed to grow unchecked." Carter leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "With respect, Chief, culture doesn't change because one guy gets suspended. All you're doing is tearing apart what little morale we've got left." Richard didn't flinch. "Morale built on intimidation and misconduct isn't worth preserving. If accountability feels like an attack, maybe it's time to reflect on why that is." A murmur rippled through the room. Carter, his face darkening, leaned forward. "Accountability is one thing. Witch hunts are another. Daniels was a good cop. He made mistakes, sure. But who hasn't? You suspend him for one bad day, and you think that solves the problem." Richard's gaze locked onto Carter. "One bad day?" Daniels' file tells a different story. Repeated complaints, consistent patterns of behavior, all ignored or dismissed. That's not one bad day. That's a system protecting its own at the expense of the people it serves. Carter opened his mouth to respond, but Richard pressed on. This department's job is to serve the community, not itself. And let me be clear, anyone who thinks otherwise can either change or find the door. No one is untouchable. Not Daniels, not you, not me. The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Richard let the words hang for a moment before continuing. This investigation isn't a punishment. It's a step toward rebuilding trust, and it's only the beginning. From this point forward, every complaint will be reviewed thoroughly. Every officer will be held to the same standard. If that makes some of you uncomfortable, so be it. In the days that followed, the division within the department became more pronounced. Carter and his allies operated as a shadow faction, their resentment simmering just below the surface. In hushed conversations and offhand remarks, they painted Richard as an outsider with no understanding of their reality, but not everyone was aligned with Carter. Officers like Reyes, who had been hesitant at first, began to question the status quo more openly. One afternoon, she approached Richard as he was walking the halls. "Chief," she began, her voice steady but quiet, "I want to do better. I've been complicit in some of the things you've called out, not because I agreed with them, but because I was scared to speak up. If you're serious about changing things, I want to help." Richard regarded her for a moment before nodding. "It starts with accountability, Reyes, for yourself and for those around you. If you see something wrong, you call it out. Change doesn't happen in silence." Meanwhile, Daniels filed an appeal against his suspension, claiming he was being unfairly targeted. Carter supported him publicly, calling the suspension an overreaction and accusing Richard of overstepping his authority. But Richard didn't waver. The internal review uncovered even more troubling patterns in Daniels' behavior, further justifying the decision. When Harris brought the findings to Richard's office, he looked grim. "Chief, this isn't just Daniels. There's a network here. A group that's been covering for each other for years. It goes deeper than we thought." Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Then we dig deeper. No more cover-ups. No more excuses." The precinct was a powder keg, with tension threatening to boil over at any moment. Richard knew he was walking a fine line, alienating some while earning the cautious support of others. But he also knew that real change was never easy, and he was prepared to face whatever resistance came next. Richard understood that dismantling a culture of misconduct wasn't a task that could be completed in a day. To succeed, he needed more than words. He needed actions that left no room for doubt. The call came in just past noon. A distressed 911 report of a man barricaded in a neighborhood convenience store with a shotgun, holding the cashier and 2 customers hostage. The precinct's radio buzzed with urgency, dispatchers relaying details in rapid-fire succession. Richard, who had been reviewing policy drafts in his office, immediately grabbed his radio and headed to the garage. "Chief, this might be a good time to observe rather than lead," Captain Harris warned as Richard climbed into a squad car. His voice carried an edge of hesitation, but Richard's expression made it clear there was no room for argument. The team deployed to the scene included several officers, among them Carter, and a few others known for their resistance to Richard's leadership. They stood in a loose group near their vehicles when Richard arrived, already armed and discussing the approach. Carter, the de facto leader among them, raised a brow as Richard approached. "Chief," Carter said, his tone neutral but his eyes challenging. "We've got a situation. A guy in there's threatening to shoot anyone who comes close. Seems unstable. Probably drugged up." Richard nodded, scanning the perimeter. Officers were positioned behind their vehicles, weapons drawn, while a negotiator attempted to de-escalate the situation through a loudspeaker. The scene was tense, and the gravity of the moment left no room for error. "What's the plan?" Richard asked, his voice calm but firm. Carter smirked slightly. "Same as always. We wait for an opening and take him down. Negotiator talks until he slips up." Richard shook his head. "We don't know his mental state or triggers. A wrong move could escalate this. We need a more measured approach. Secure the perimeter, but no one goes in unless I give the order." Carter's jaw tightened. "With respect, Chief, we've handled situations like this before. No offense, but sitting on our hands while this guy decides to pull the trigger isn't my idea of a plan." Richard stepped closer, his voice dropping. And my plan doesn't involve civilian casualties because someone got impatient. This isn't a negotiation, Officer Carter. It's an order. The tension between them was palpable, but Carter reluctantly turned away, muttering under his breath. As the standoff dragged on, the tension among the officers grew. The suspect screamed incoherently inside, demanding money and threatening to harm the hostages. The negotiator worked tirelessly, but the man's erratic behavior made progress slow. Carter, pacing near the squad cars, glanced back at Richard, who stood near the command post, monitoring the situation. "We're wasting time," Carter muttered to one of his allies. "This guy's a ticking time bomb. We need to act before it's too late." Without waiting for approval, Carter signaled 2 other officers to follow him. They moved to flank the store, their movements swift but deliberate. Richard saw them immediately. His voice cut through the air. "Carter, stand down." Carter ignored him, motioning for his team to take position. "Officer Carter, I said stand down." Richard's voice boomed, sharp and commanding. Carter hesitated but waved off Richard's command. "We're doing this. You can file your complaints later," he snapped before signaling the breach. The chaos unfolded in seconds. Carter and his team burst through the side door, startling the suspect, who turned and fired a warning shot into the air. The hostages screamed, ducking behind counters as the officers shouted conflicting commands. The suspect panicked, swinging the shotgun wildly. Richard, hearing the commotion, sprinted toward the building, ordering the rest of the team to hold their positions. He grabbed a tactical shield from the nearest vehicle and charged into the store. Inside, the scene was chaos. Carter was yelling at the suspect to drop the weapon, but his tone only fueled the man's paranoia. One hostage tried to crawl away, but the suspect caught sight of the movement and swung the barrel toward her. Richard acted instinctively. "Stop!" he shouted, stepping into the man's line of sight with the shield raised. "Lower your weapon. You're surrounded, but no one needs to get hurt." The suspect hesitated, his breathing erratic, his grip on the shotgun unsteady. Richard kept his tone calm but authoritative. "This doesn't end with you getting hurt. Let them go, and we'll talk. I'll make sure you're treated fairly." Behind him, Carter muttered, "He's not going to listen. Just take the shot." "Quiet!" Richard snapped without looking back, his focus unwavering. The suspect's hands began to shake, and the shotgun wavered. I didn't mean for this to happen," the man stammered, tears streaming down his face. Richard seized the moment. "Then let's fix it." "Put it down. You don't want anyone hurt. Neither do I." Slowly, the man lowered the shotgun. As he dropped it to the floor, Richard moved forward, gesturing for the other officers to secure him. The hostages scrambled to safety, sobbing but unharmed. Outside, as paramedics tended to the shaken hostages, Richard turned to Carter. The tension between them boiled over. "What the hell was that?" Richard demanded, his voice sharp. "I gave a direct order to hold position." Carter didn't back down. "Your plan was getting us nowhere. That guy was about to snap. I made a call." "You made the wrong call," Richard shot back. "You ignored my order and put lives at risk. One wrong move, and those hostages wouldn't be walking out of here alive." Carter's face reddened. "I've been doing this job a long time, Chief. I know when to act. And I've spent my career ensuring that acting doesn't mean reckless endangerment," Richard retorted. "This isn't about you, Carter. It's about doing what's right, not what strokes your ego." The argument drew the attention of nearby officers, their expressions a mix of unease and curiosity. Carter, realizing the audience he'd drawn, muttered, "We'll see how long your way lasts." "Not if you keep undermining it," Richard said firmly. "This is your last warning. If you can't follow orders, you're not fit to wear that badge." The fallout from the incident was immediate. While the hostages were safe, the recklessness of Carter's actions led to a formal reprimand and further scrutiny of his conduct. The division within the department deepened, with some officers siding with Carter, viewing Richard as overly rigid, while others began to appreciate the discipline he was trying to instill. For Richard, the incident solidified one truth. The culture of the department wasn't just resistant to change, it was actively hostile to it. But if he wanted to see real transformation, he would need to face that hostility head-on. Though the crisis had been resolved, the cracks within the department were more evident than ever, and Richard knew the road to reform would only grow steeper. Daniel's suspension might have removed him from the precinct physically, but his presence lingered like a storm cloud. Within days, he filed a formal appeal, claiming that his suspension was unjust and accusing Richard of targeting him based on personal bias. The appeal was only the beginning of his retaliation. Daniels, refusing to accept his punishment quietly, began orchestrating a campaign against Richard. He contacted former colleagues, dug into old files, and searched for anything he could use to undermine the new chief. Late one night, he shared drinks with Officer Steve Carter at a local bar, their conversation cloaked in low murmurs and conspiratorial tones. "This guy walks in and thinks he's got all the answers," Daniels muttered, his voice tight with resentment. "But I know he's hiding something. Nobody climbs the ranks that fast without skeletons in their closet." Carter took a sip of his drink, his expression unreadable. "Even if you find something, what's your plan? The guy's not going down without a fight." Daniels smirked. "Oh, he'll go down. I just need the right push." Meanwhile, Richard pressed forward with the internal investigation into Daniels' record. Captain Harris brought a thick stack of reports to Richard's office, his expression grim. "You're going to want to see this," Harris said, placing the documents on Richard's desk. Richard flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing with each new detail. Complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, and derogatory remarks lined the file. Some incidents had been quietly closed with vague explanations. Others had simply disappeared. "How many of these were swept under the rug?" Richard asked, his voice low but heavy with anger. Harris hesitated before replying, "Too many." Daniels had friends in high places, people who didn't want to disrupt the department over what they called minor issues. Richard's jaw tightened. "These aren't minor issues. This is a pattern of abuse that's been ignored for years." He slammed the file shut, his frustration simmering beneath the surface. "This is exactly the culture we need to dismantle." Word of the investigation spread quickly, further polarizing the precinct. Carter and his faction openly criticized Richard's actions, accusing him of targeting Daniels for personal reasons. In the locker room, tensions reached a boiling point when Officer Maria Reyes, who had begun supporting Richard's reforms, confronted Carter. "How can you defend someone like Daniels?" Reyes asked, her voice trembling with both anger and conviction. "You've seen the complaints. You know what he's done," Carter scoffed, slamming his locker shut. "Complaints don't mean guilt, Reyes. People file reports all the time to cover their own mistakes. Daniels was a good cop, and now he's being railroaded." "A good cop?" Reyes shot back. "Good cops don't spit in someone's face or use their badge as a shield for their prejudice." Carter stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "Watch your tone, rookie. You think siding with Miller makes you better than the rest of us? You don't know how things work here." Reyes stood her ground, her eyes locked on his. Maybe it's time things changed. The day of Daniels' appeal hearing arrived, bringing an air of unease to the precinct. Daniels appeared confident, dressed sharply in a suit, his smirk firmly in place. His lawyer wasted no time painting a picture of a respected officer, unfairly targeted by an overzealous chief. "Officer Daniels has served this department for over a decade," the lawyer declared. "His record speaks for itself. Yes, there have been complaints, but nothing that warranted this kind of drastic action. Chief Miller's decision was not about justice. It was personal." Richard, seated across the room, listened intently, his expression unreadable. When it was his turn to speak, he rose and walked to the center of the room, commanding attention without raising his voice. "Daniels' record does speak for itself," Richard began, holding up the thick file of complaints. "And it tells a story of a man who has abused his power repeatedly, protected by a system that chose to look the other way. This isn't personal. It's about accountability. If we can't hold ourselves to the highest standards, how can we expect the community to trust us?" Daniels shifted in his seat, his confidence waning as murmurs filled the room. Richard pressed on. "This department's job is to protect and serve everyone, not just those who fit a certain mold. If you can't uphold that principle, you have no business wearing this badge." The hearing concluded with the denial of Daniels' appeal. He stormed out, his face a mask of fury, while Carter and his allies looked on, their expressions dark and silent. The appeal's resolution didn't bring closure. If anything, it heightened the tension. That evening, Richard called a meeting with his leadership team. "We've only scratched the surface," Richard said, addressing the group. "Daniels isn't the problem, he's a symptom. There are others like him, officers who've been protected by this culture for far too long. That ends now." Harris nodded, though his face betrayed concern. "You're not making friends, Chief. Some of the senior officers are already talking about pushing back harder." Richard's gaze hardened. "I'm not here to make friends. I'm here to make this department better. If that means stepping on a few toes, so be it." As the investigation deepened, Richard and Harris uncovered evidence of a network within the precinct. A group of officers who had covered for each other's misconduct for years. The files revealed patterns of complaints dismissed without proper review, incidents rewritten to protect the guilty, and a culture of silence enforced through intimidation. "They're protecting each other at every level," Harris said, laying out the findings in Richard's office. "This goes deeper than Daniels." Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression steely. "Then we take it apart piece by piece. Start with the files. Reopen every case connected to this group. We'll show them that the old rules don't apply anymore." The protests began early on a cloudy Thursday morning. A group of citizens had gathered outside the precinct, their voices rising in chants that echoed through the surrounding streets. They carried signs bearing messages like, "No more corrupt cops," and "Accountability now." The tension was palpable, and the sight of officers standing stiffly behind the precinct's glass doors only added fuel to the fire. Inside, Richard Miller observed the scene from his office window. He had anticipated this moment. Daniels's suspension and the ongoing investigation had sent ripples through the department, but it was clear the community wasn't satisfied. They wanted more. Answers, action, and a reason to believe things would change. One of the protest leaders, a woman named Lisa Gordon, stepped forward with a megaphone. Her voice cut through the noise, fierce and commanding. "How many more times do we have to ask for justice?" she demanded. "How many more reports of abuse will be ignored? We're tired of empty promises." The crowd roared in agreement. Inside, officers watched with a mix of unease and disdain. Carter stood near the main entrance, arms crossed, his expression dark. "This is what happens when you start pandering," he muttered to a nearby officer. "They smell blood and keep coming." Richard entered the room, his presence silencing the quiet grumbles. "Carter," he said sharply, "if you have something to say it to me." Carter turned, his smirk barely concealing his irritation. "Just calling it like I see it, Chief. You give these people an inch and they'll take a mile." Richard's tone was cold. "These people are the community we serve. If you can't respect that, you're in the wrong job." To address the growing unrest, Richard organized a town hall meeting that evening. Flyers went up around the neighborhood, and word spread quickly. By 7 p.m., the precinct's largest meeting room was packed with residents. The atmosphere was tense, the air buzzing with anticipation. Officers sat along one side of the room, their expressions ranging from cautious to defiant. Carter sat among them, his arms crossed, his face a mask of indifference. Richard stepped to the front, scanning the crowd before speaking. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began. "I know many of you are here because you're angry, hurt, and distrustful of this department. And I don't blame you. There have been failures here. Failures to protect, failures to listen, and failures to hold people accountable. That's why I'm here, to make sure those failures stop." Lisa Gordon stood up from the audience, her voice sharp. "Words are easy, Chief. Actions aren't." Daniels was suspended. "But what about the rest? What about the officers who looked the other way? What about justice for people like my brother?" The room fell silent as Lisa's words hung in the air. She gestured to a young man sitting beside her, his posture tense, his face etched with discomfort. "This is Malcolm," she continued. "Last year, Daniels arrested him for loitering. He wasn't loitering. He was waiting for a friend outside a store. But Daniels decided he didn't belong there. He humiliated him in front of everyone, shoved him into a squad car, and called him a thug. The charges were dropped, but the damage was done." Malcolm shifted uncomfortably under the weight of the room's collective gaze. "I just want to live my life without feeling like I'm a target," he said quietly. "Is that too much to ask?" Carter seized the moment to interject. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Chief, with all due respect, are we seriously going to let personal anecdotes dictate how we run this department? Daniels did his job. Maybe his methods weren't perfect, but he kept the streets safe. The room erupted in murmurs of anger and disbelief. Richard raised a hand, silencing the crowd, his gaze fixed on Carter, his voice sharp. Safe for who, Carter? Certainly not for Malcolm or the dozens of others who've filed complaints about Daniels over the years. Keeping the streets safe doesn't mean trampling on the rights of the people who live there. Carter folded his arms, his jaw tight. You're tearing this department apart for a few bad apples. Richard stepped closer, his tone unwavering. It's not about bad apples, Carter. It's about a system that lets those apples rot without consequence. And if you can't see that, then maybe you're part of the problem. The tension between the two was palpable, the room holding its breath as their words collided. Carter finally sat down, his expression unreadable. Richard turned back to the audience, his tone softening. I know trust isn't rebuilt overnight. I know there are scars. And I know it's going to take more than words to heal them. But I need your help. This community deserves a department it can trust, and that starts with accountability. From me, from every officer here, and from all of you. Hold us accountable. Demand better. And if you see progress, acknowledge it, so we can keep moving forward together. The room was silent for a long moment before Lisa spoke again, her voice quieter this time. What happens next, Chief? What's your plan? Richard nodded. The investigation into Daniels is just the beginning. Every complaint that's been swept under the rug is being reopened. Every officer will be held to the same standard, no exceptions. But we also need to work together, officers and citizens, to rebuild this relationship. That means regular meetings like this. It means transparency. And it means listening, even when it's uncomfortable. As the meeting concluded, the tension in the room had shifted. While not everyone was satisfied, there was a sense of cautious optimism. People began to trickle out, some stopping to shake Richard's hand or exchange a few words of support. Malcolm approached him hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper. I hope you mean what you said, Chief. Richard met his gaze. I do, Malcolm, and I won't stop until this department earns your trust. Back in the precinct, Carter confronted Richard privately. You think that dog and pony show solved anything? He sneered. It's a start, Richard replied, his tone icy. The only question is whether you're going to be part of the solution or remain part of the problem. Carter didn't respond, his silence louder than words. The tension within the precinct had yet to ease, but Richard Miller wasn't waiting for approval. He announced a mandatory training program for all officers, focusing on implicit bias, de-escalation techniques, and rebuilding community trust. The sessions were non-negotiable. Every officer, from rookies to veterans, would attend. The response was predictable. Another waste of time, Carter grumbled in the locker room. What's next? A seminar on how to smile for the cameras? Others muttered in agreement, but not everyone shared his cynicism. Officer Maria Reyes, seated nearby, glanced up from lacing her boots. Or maybe it's a chance to be better at the job, she said quietly. Carter shot her a glare. You've been here, what, 6 months? Don't start lecturing me on what this job is about. Reyes didn't respond, but the tension between them lingered as they filed out to begin the training. The first training session was held in the precinct's largest meeting room. Richard stood at the front, flanked by a guest facilitator, a retired officer known for his work in community engagement. The officers sat in uneasy silence, their expressions ranging from skepticism to outright hostility. This isn't about finger-pointing, the facilitator began, his voice calm but firm. This is about recognizing the ways we're shaped by our experiences and how those influences can affect our decisions on the job. It's about understanding the community you serve and making choices that build trust, not destroy it. As the facilitator spoke, Richard observed the room. Carter sat in the back, arms crossed, his face a mask of indifference. Others fidgeted or avoided eye contact, but a few, like Reyes, leaned forward, engaged despite the atmosphere. The facilitator handed out a survey, asking officers to reflect on their own biases and assumptions. Groans echoed through the room, but Richard remained steadfast. You can roll your eyes all you want. he said, his voice cutting through the noise. But if you can't look at yourself critically, you have no business judging anyone else. The turning point came later that week, during a smaller breakout session. Officers were encouraged to share experiences that had shaped their perspectives on the job. Most remained silent, but Reyes finally spoke up, her voice hesitant at first. "When I first got here," she began, "I kept my head down. I didn't question anything, even when I knew it was wrong." Her eyes darted briefly to Carter before she continued. "I laughed at the jokes, ignored the comments, pretended I didn't see things I should have reported. I told myself it was just how things worked, that it wasn't my place to speak up." The room was silent now, every eye on her. "But the truth is, I was scared. Scared of being ostracized, scared of being seen as weak or disloyal. And that fear made me complicit." Her voice broke slightly, but she pressed on. "I don't want to be that kind of officer anymore. If we're here to protect and serve, then that has to mean everyone, not just the people it's easy to protect." When she finished, the room remained quiet for a moment before Richard spoke. "Thank you, Reyes," he said, his tone steady. "It takes courage to admit you've fallen short. But real courage is what comes next, choosing to do better, even when it's hard." Later that day, Carter confronted Reyes in the hallway. "That was a nice speech," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You trying to earn brownie points with the chief?" Reyes turned to face him, her jaw set. "I'm trying to be the kind of officer I'd want protecting my family. If that bothers you, maybe you're the one who needs to rethink things." Carter sneered but didn't reply, stalking off down the hall. Watching him go, Reyes felt a flicker of doubt, but it was quickly replaced by resolve. She wasn't going to let his disdain deter her. Over the next few weeks, the training sessions began to have a noticeable effect. Officers who had once dismissed the idea started to engage more openly, sharing their own experiences and perspectives. Small shifts in behavior began to emerge. Less confrontational language in the field, more effort to de-escalate tense situations, and a greater willingness to listen to the community. Richard made it a point to walk the halls regularly, checking in with officers and encouraging those who were embracing the changes. He found Reyes reviewing her notes in the break room one afternoon. "How's it going?" he asked, pulling up a chair. "Better than I expected," she admitted. "It's still hard, but I feel like I'm actually making a difference." Richard nodded. "Change is never easy, but it's worth it. And it starts with people like you. People who aren't afraid to do the right thing, even when it's hard." The real test of the training came during a routine call about a domestic dispute. Reyes and another officer, Tom Delgado, arrived at the scene to find a man yelling at his partner on the front lawn. In the past, the situation might have escalated immediately, with raised voices and threats of arrest. But this time, Reyes approached calmly, speaking in a measured tone. "Sir, let's take a step back and talk," she said, positioning herself at a safe distance. "We're here to help, not make things worse." The man, though initially defensive, eventually calmed down enough to explain the situation. By the time they left, the conflict had been de-escalated without arrests or violence. Delgado, who had been skeptical of the new training, admitted afterward that it had made a difference. "Maybe there's something to this," he said, half smiling. While not everyone embraced the changes, the small victories began to add up. Complaints from the community decreased, and the precinct's reputation slowly started to improve. Officers like Reyes became unofficial ambassadors of the new culture, demonstrating through their actions that the department could evolve. But the resistance wasn't gone. Carter and his allies continued to grumble, their discontent simmering beneath the surface. Richard knew that dismantling years of entrenched attitudes would take time, but the signs of progress were undeniable. The weeks following Daniels' appeal denial were tense. Rather than accept the suspension quietly, Daniels launched a personal campaign against Richard, determined to discredit him. Behind the scenes, he scoured Richard's history, reaching out to former colleagues and digging through old records, hoping to find something, anything, that could tarnish the chief's reputation. Daniels found an ally in Carter, who encouraged his efforts. "If he's going to hold us to such a high standard, let's see if he measures up," Carter said one evening in a low voice. "Everyone's got something they don't want the world to see." The first sign of Daniels' counterattack came in the form of anonymous tips to local reporters, insinuating that Richard had manipulated arrest numbers during his time as a precinct captain in another city. The claims were vague, but damaging enough to warrant attention. When asked for comment, Richard dismissed the allegations as baseless. "I've always been transparent in my work," he said firmly. "Anyone who doubts that is welcome to review the records." Richard instructed his staff to compile a full audit of his career, leaving no detail unexamined. Within days, the accusations unraveled. The numbers Daniels had tried to twist were proven accurate, and the reporters who'd pursued the story backed off, realizing there was no scandal to expose. Instead of weakening Richard's position, the smear campaign only reinforced his integrity. But Daniels wasn't finished. One evening, Richard received an email from an anonymous sender. Attached was a video showing Daniels in conversation with Carter and two other officers, openly mocking Richard's leadership and plotting ways to undermine his authority. The video had been recorded by a disillusioned officer in Carter's circle, one who had grown tired of their toxic influence. The next morning, Richard called an emergency meeting, summoning Daniels, Carter, and the officers from the video into his office. The atmosphere was electric with tension as the group filed in, their faces a mixture of defiance and unease. Richard wasted no time. He played the video without a word. As the audio filled the room, Daniels' smirk faded, replaced by a mask of shock. Carter crossed his arms, but his confident posture wavered. When the recording ended, Richard turned to Daniels. "Is this how you honor the badge? By conspiring to sabotage your own department?" Daniels shifted in his seat. "That video's out of context," he began, but Richard cut him off. "Out of context?" Richard's voice was calm, but his anger simmered just beneath the surface. "You've spent weeks trying to tear me down, not because I've done anything wrong, but because I dared to hold you accountable. You don't care about this department, Daniels. You care about your ego." Daniels leaned forward, his tone defensive. "You don't understand how things work here. You come in, act like you're better than everyone, and expect us to follow blindly. Respect has to be earned, Chief." Richard stepped closer, his voice sharp. "Respect isn't earned by turning a blind eye to misconduct. It's earned by leading with integrity, something you clearly know nothing about." The confrontation reached its peak when Daniels stood abruptly, slamming his hands on the table. "You don't know what it's like to be out there every day," he shouted. "You sit in your office making rules, but you've never dealt with the real danger, the real pressure." Richard remained unfazed. "I've been on the streets. I've faced danger, and I know what pressure feels like. But that's no excuse for abuse, for prejudice, or for betraying the trust of the people we serve." Daniels' defiance faltered as Richard continued. "When you spat in my face that first day, you didn't just disrespect me. You disrespected the badge, the oath we swore, and every officer who wears it with pride. And now you've shown your true colors, someone who would rather destroy this department than admit their own failures." The room fell silent, the weight of Richard's words pressing down on everyone present. Daniels, visibly shaken, lowered his gaze. That afternoon, Richard held a press conference to announce the findings of the investigation into Daniels. He outlined the pattern of misconduct, the cover-ups, and the recent attempts to undermine the department's reforms. Daniels was formally terminated, and his actions were referred to the state for further review. Carter, though not directly implicated, found his influence waning. Officers who had once rallied around him began to distance themselves, unwilling to be associated with his toxicity. As Richard returned to his office that evening, he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. Daniels was gone, but the scars he left behind remained. The culture that had enabled him wouldn't disappear overnight, and there were still officers resistant to change. Captain Harris entered, a stack of files in hand. "Thought you'd want to see these," he said. "Complaints are down this month, significantly." Richard nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "It's a start," he said quietly. Harris hesitated before speaking again. "You handled Daniels better than most would have." "A lot of people are watching, Chief, and not just in here." Richard met his gaze. "Let them watch. The work isn't done yet." The precinct was quieter now, though not in the way it had been before. The absence of Daniels and several other officers who had chosen to resign rather than adapt left gaps in the ranks. But rather than weaken the department, Their departure opened the door for something new. Richard wasted no time. With Captain Harris and a trusted panel, he spearheaded a rigorous recruitment campaign to bring in fresh talent. Candidates were carefully vetted, not just for their qualifications, but for their character and commitment to serving the community with integrity. During one interview, a young recruit named Caleb Johnson sat across from Richard, his nervous energy palpable. "Why do you want to join Blue Ridge PD?" Richard asked, his tone even but probing. "I want to make a difference, sir," Caleb replied, his voice steady. "Growing up here, I saw how the community and the police didn't trust each other. I want to be part of changing that." Richard leaned back, scrutinizing him. "It's not an easy job, especially in a department trying to rebuild. Why should I believe you're ready for that challenge?" Caleb met Richard's gaze without hesitation. "Because I believe in what you're doing here, Chief. I know it's going to be hard, but I'm willing to put in the work." Richard nodded slowly. "We'll see if your actions match your words. Welcome to Blue Ridge." Caleb was one of several new recruits who embodied the kind of officer Richard wanted in the department: committed, respectful, and eager to learn. The new recruits brought a noticeable energy to the precinct. They were open to the changes Richard had implemented and embraced the ongoing training sessions. Older officers who had been skeptical began to soften, their resistance waning as they saw the department begin to function more cohesively. One afternoon, Officer Reyes walked into Richard's office with a small stack of papers. "Chief, I just wanted to let you know, Officer Delgado and I started a mentoring group for the new recruits. We figured they could use some guidance as they settle in." Richard looked up, surprised but pleased. "Good initiative, Reyes. Make sure they know my door is always open." Reyes smiled. "They already do, sir." In the community, changes were starting to show. Complaints against officers had dropped noticeably, and interactions between the police and residents were beginning to shift. During a routine patrol, Reyes and Caleb responded to a noise complaint in a neighborhood known for its tense relationship with law enforcement. Instead of escalating the situation, they took the time to speak with the residents, listening to their frustrations and resolving the issue without conflict. Afterward, one of the residents, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Ellis, stopped them on the way out. "Thank you for listening," she said. "It's been a long time since anyone from your department did that." Reyes nodded. "It's what we're here for, ma'am." Word of such encounters began to spread. Slowly but surely, the community started to see the department in a different light. While skepticism remained, a sense of cautious optimism began to take root. Richard attended a community meeting one evening, where several residents had gathered to discuss ongoing issues. Lisa Gordon, once a fierce critic, stood up to speak. "I won't lie. I was one of the first people to call for your resignation," she said, her tone blunt but not unkind. "But over the past few months, I've seen things start to change. Officers are treating people with respect. Complaints are being taken seriously. It's not perfect, but it's better." A ripple of agreement moved through the room. Another resident added, "It's a start. We're finally seeing the department take responsibility." Richard stood, addressing the crowd with his usual calm authority. "I appreciate your honesty, and I won't pretend that the work is done. But I promise you, this department is committed to earning your trust every day. If we fall short, I want you to hold us accountable." Despite the progress, not everyone was convinced. Carter and a small group of remaining officers still grumbled in private, their discontent bubbling beneath the surface. They avoided outright defiance, but their lack of enthusiasm was evident. One day, Carter approached Richard in the hallway. "You think swapping out a few officers and hosting some training sessions is enough to fix this place?" he asked, his tone laced with sarcasm. Richard didn't hesitate. "No, I don't. But it's a start. And if you're not willing to be part of the solution, Carter, you might want to consider your next move." Carter stared at him for a moment before walking away, his expression unreadable. During a staff meeting later that week, Richard addressed the entire department. "We've made progress, but we can't get complacent," he said, his voice firm. "Every day we have to choose to do better, for ourselves, for each other, and for the community we serve. This isn't just my vision, it's our responsibility." The room was silent, but the weight of his words was evident. Officers exchanged glances, some nodding subtly. For the first time, it felt like the department was beginning to move as one, with the worst offenders gone and the department's structure beginning to stabilize. Richard Miller turned his focus to ensuring the changes would stick. His first order of business was implementing a rigorous oversight system. Every officer's actions, from field work to internal conduct, would now be subject to review. Complaints would no longer be dismissed without thorough investigation, and patterns of behavior would be tracked to prevent recurring issues. Richard introduced the Integrity Oversight Program, a comprehensive system designed to hold everyone accountable. Officers were required to log detailed reports of their interactions, all of which would be reviewed by a newly formed internal audit team. Body camera footage, once inconsistently monitored, became a critical tool in evaluating officers' conduct. During a morning briefing, Richard laid out the new protocols. "This isn't about micromanagement," he said, scanning the room. "It's about ensuring transparency and rebuilding trust. If you're doing your job the right way, you have nothing to worry about. If you're not, this system will find it. And so will I." Carter, seated near the back, leaned toward a colleague and muttered, "Another layer of bureaucracy. Like we don't already have enough hoops to jump through." Richard caught the comment but didn't address it directly. Instead, he continued, "This department has been given too many second chances. Those days are over. We're setting a standard, and it applies to everyone, myself included." The oversight program didn't just address current issues. It also dredged up unresolved complaints from the past. Among them was a case involving Officer Carter, tied to an excessive force allegation that had been buried years ago. The internal audit team flagged the file, and Richard called Carter into his office. Carter entered, his usual swagger muted. He glanced at the file on Richard's desk, his expression hardening. "Let me guess," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're digging up old dirt now?" Richard's tone was firm but calm. "This isn't about the past, Carter. It's about accountability. This complaint should have been addressed when it was filed, but it wasn't. That's not on you. But what happens next is..." Carter leaned forward, his voice low and defensive. "I did what I had to do that day. You weren't there. You don't know what it's like in the heat of the moment." "I wasn't there," Richard acknowledged. "But I'm here now. And I'm giving you the chance to tell your side before we move forward." The conversation ended without resolution, but the tension between them was palpable. Carter left the office with his jaw clenched, muttering under his breath. As the internal reforms gained traction, the local press took notice. Articles began to appear, highlighting the changes in Blue Ridge PD. Headlines like, "Blue Ridge Police Department takes accountability seriously," and "A new era of policing under Chief Miller," painted the department in a positive light. One afternoon, a reporter from the Blue Ridge Gazette requested an interview with Richard. The questions were pointed but fair, focusing on the challenges he faced and the progress he had made. "Chief Miller," the reporter asked, "what do you say to critics who claim your reforms are more about optics than substance?" Richard didn't hesitate. "I'd tell them to talk to the officers who've embraced these changes and the residents who've seen the difference firsthand. This isn't about appearances. It's about doing the work. And we're just getting started." The article that followed painted Richard as a principled leader willing to make tough decisions, earning him praise from parts of the community and cautious respect from others. Inside the department, the reaction to the media attention was mixed. Some officers saw it as validation of their efforts, while others, like Carter, viewed it as a superficial PR campaign. During a lunch break, a group of officers debated the coverage. "It's nice to see people finally acknowledging the work we're doing," Reyes said, her tone optimistic. Carter, seated at a nearby table, scoffed. "It's just spin. You think a few articles change how people see us? Give it a few months. They'll find something else to criticize." Reyes met his gaze steadily. "Maybe. But if we keep doing the work, they'll have less to criticize." "Isn't that the point?" Carter didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. Despite the progress, new challenges emerged. One evening, Richard received a call about an incident involving a rookie officer who had mishandled a routine traffic stop, leading to a heated altercation. While no one was hurt, the situation reignited public scrutiny. The next morning, Richard addressed the precinct. "Last night's incident is a reminder that this work is far from over," he said, his tone grave. "Mistakes will happen, but how we respond to them defines us. This department doesn't sweep problems under the rug anymore. We confront them, we learn from them, and we make sure they don't happen again. He ordered an immediate review of the incident and personally met with the officer involved. Their conversation was candid but constructive, focusing on what went wrong and how to improve. The incident, while a setback, highlighted the effectiveness of the new oversight system. The swift and transparent response earned praise from community leaders, who saw it as evidence of real change. Lisa Gordon, once a fierce critic of the department, approached Richard after a community meeting. "I didn't think I'd say this, Chief," she admitted, "but I'm starting to believe in what you're doing here. Keep proving me right." 1 year after Richard Miller walked into Blue Ridge PD undercover, the precinct looked and felt like a different place. The toxic undercurrents that had once defined the department had been uprooted. While not eradicated entirely, the worst offenders were gone, and a sense of accountability had taken hold. The walls, once filled with murmurs of distrust and resentment, now carried a hum of purpose and professionalism. Richard stood in his office, looking out over the precinct floor. Officers moved with focus, some collaborating on cases, others speaking with members of the community who had come in for assistance. The camaraderie was real, not built on exclusion or intimidation, but on mutual respect and a shared commitment to their mission. Outside the precinct, the changes were just as apparent. Community events hosted by the department were better attended, with residents and officers engaging in open dialogue. Complaints against the police had dropped significantly, replaced by reports of positive interactions. Richard attended one such event in the park, where officers had set up booths to offer safety tips, distribute resources, and engage with families. A boy around 10 years old approached him hesitantly, clutching a toy badge in his hand. Richard recognized him immediately. It was Malcolm, Lisa Gordon's nephew, who had been the subject of one of Daniel's abusive encounters. "Chief Miller?" the boy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard crouched to meet his gaze. "That's me. How can I help you?" The boy hesitated, then smiled shyly. "I just wanted to say thank you. My mom and dad, they say the police are different now. They don't feel scared anymore." Richard's chest tightened, and he felt a rare wave of emotion threaten to surface. "Thank you, Malcolm. That means more than you know. And you tell your parents we're going to keep working to make things better, okay?" The boy nodded and handed Richard the toy badge. "Here, I want you to have this." Richard accepted the gift, his smile genuine. "I'll take good care of it." Back at the precinct that evening, Richard called a leadership meeting. He stood at the head of the table, his tone thoughtful but firm. "We've made progress," he began. "But progress doesn't mean we stop. It means we push harder, hold ourselves to higher standards, and never let complacency set in." Captain Harris, seated to his right, spoke up. "Chief, you've done more in a year than most could do in 5. You should take some credit for that." Richard shook his head. "This isn't about me. It's about all of us. Every officer who's stepped up, every community member who's given us a second chance. They're the reason this works. But we can't afford to let up. Not now, not ever." Later that week, Richard observed a patrol team as they handled a potentially volatile situation. A protest outside a government building. In the past, such events often escalated into confrontations. But this time, officers engaged with the protesters respectfully, maintaining order without aggression. By the end of the day, the protest concluded peacefully, a stark contrast to the tense scenes that had once defined Blue Ridge. Reyes, now a respected leader among the newer officers, approached Richard afterward. "We're getting there," she said, her voice tinged with pride. Richard nodded. "One step at a time." As the evening drew to a close, Richard walked through the precinct one last time, taking in the sight of his team. Carter was gone. He had resigned months earlier, unable to adapt to the new culture. In his place were officers like Caleb, Reyes, and Delgado, who embodied the values Richard had fought to instill. He paused in the hallway, watching as Reyes explained a procedure to a pair of rookies. Nearby, Caleb was laughing with a group of officers, the camaraderie genuine and free of the toxic hierarchies that had once plagued the department. For the first time in a long while, Richard felt a deep sense of hope. The journey had been grueling, filled with resistance and setbacks, But the results were undeniable. A department transforming itself, step by step, into a force that the community could trust and respect. As Richard stood in the doorway of his office, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The challenges were far from over, and there would always be more work to do. But the foundation had been laid, and the precinct was finally moving in the right direction. He placed Malcolm's toy badge on his desk, a reminder of why he had taken on this monumental task. The road ahead was long, but he was ready for it. Difficult doesn't mean impossible, he thought. Every step forward is worth it. Richard Miller's journey wasn't just about reforming a precinct. It was about proving that change, while difficult, is achievable with determination and integrity. The transformation of Blue Ridge PD serves as a powerful reminder that even in the face of resistance, progress is possible. One decision, one conversation, and one step at a time. But what about you? Do you think real change is possible in organizations with deeply rooted issues? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more content that highlights leadership, perseverance, and the power of change. Together, we can keep these important conversations alive.
The day was unusually warm for early fall. The sun bathed the quiet, tree-lined street in a golden light, casting long shadows across the well-manicured lawns of the sprawling suburban houses. Marcus Reed stood in front of his newly purchased home, wrestling with a stubborn front door lock. A few large cardboard boxes sat at his feet, and his shirt clung to his back, damp with sweat. He sighed, feeling a mix of frustration and excitement. "Come on," he muttered to himself, jiggling the key in the lock again. Not now. He had only been in the house for a few days, and it already felt like a battle to settle in. Moving into this exclusive, predominantly white neighborhood had been a calculated decision. He needed the space, the quiet, somewhere to recharge between film shoots and red carpets. The calm of this affluent suburb seemed like the perfect escape. Yet, as he fumbled with the door, there was a gnawing feeling in his stomach that he couldn't quite shake. The stares, the awkward silences from neighbors, the unspoken question behind their eyes. What's he doing here? A police cruiser slowly rolled down the street, breaking the stillness. The hum of the engine grew louder, and Marcus glanced up briefly, catching sight of the officer inside. He paid no mind at first. This was just the routine patrol of a quiet, upper-class neighborhood. Nothing to worry about. But the car didn't keep moving. It stopped. The door to the cruiser slammed shut, and heavy footsteps echoed on the pavement behind Marcus. He felt a chill crawl up his spine, but he kept his eyes on the lock, trying not to overthink the situation. Still, the weight of someone's gaze bore down on him. "You having trouble there?" A voice barked out. Marcus turned around, his hands still on the door handle. A white police officer, stocky and imposing, stood just a few feet away. His hand rested on his holstered gun, his eyes narrow and suspicious. Yeah, Marcus said, raising his hand slightly in a gesture of calm. "It's just a tricky lock. I just moved in." The officer didn't move. He didn't blink. "You live here?" Marcus nodded. "Yeah, I do. Bought the place last week. I'm just trying to get inside." The officer's expression didn't change. He took a step closer, his hand now gripping the gun's handle. "ID? What?" Marcus blinked, surprised. "Show me your ID. I need to verify you live here." Marcus's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. "Look, officer, I'm just trying to get into my own house. The movers dropped these off this morning, and I'm just trying to—" "ID now," the officer interrupted, his tone sharp and unyielding. Marcus sighed, trying to keep his temper in check. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. Okay. Just give me a second." He handed over his driver's license, watching the officer's eyes flick down to the card, then back to his face. There was a brief moment where Marcus hoped the situation would resolve itself, where the officer would hand back his ID, maybe offer an apology, and leave him in peace. But instead, the officer's face twisted with disbelief. "This says you live in LA, he said, his voice dripping with accusation. "I do," Marcus replied, trying to stay calm. "I have houses in both places. I just bought this one." The paperwork is still being finalized, but I'm the owner. You can check." Before Marcus could finish, the officer's hand shot out, grabbing him by the collar of his shirt. The force of the grip yanked Marcus off balance, his back slamming against the door. Pain shot up his spine. "What the hell are you doing?" Marcus shouted, his voice a mix of shock and fear. "Shut up." The officer spat, his face inches from Marcus's. "You think you can just waltz in here and rob one of these houses? You're not fooling me. I'm not robbing anything." Marcus tried to push the officer's hands away, but the officer shoved him harder, pressing his forearm against Marcus's chest, pinning him against the door. "You don't live here," the officer growled. "I know your type. Thinking you can come into a nice neighborhood, pull some Hollywood stunt. I don't care who you are. I live here." Marcus gasped, trying to breathe against the weight crushing his chest. "Check the papers, check." The officer pulled back slightly, only to punch Marcus squarely in the jaw. The impact sent him sprawling to the ground, his head spinning. He tasted blood. "You think I haven't heard this crap before?" The officer loomed over him, fists clenched. "You think you can talk your way out of this?" Marcus lay on the ground, dazed, his vision blurry. Through the fog of pain, he could see a few neighbors standing on their lawns, watching. No one moved. No one said a word. "Please," Marcus muttered, barely able to form the words. "Just call someone. Check the records. I'm telling you the truth." But the officer wasn't listening. He was too far gone, his mind clouded with prejudice. He grabbed Marcus by the arm, wrenching him to his feet. At that moment, a voice shouted from across the street. "Wait! Stop! He's the owner!" The officer froze, turning to face the neighbor running toward them. Marcus blinked, trying to focus on the figure, his body swaying with pain and exhaustion. "He's Marcus Reed, the actor. He bought the house." The officer's face went pale. He turned back to Marcus, his grip loosening, eyes wide with disbelief. Marcus stood there, breathless, blood trickling from his mouth, his chest heaving with a mixture of rage and humiliation. For a second, everything stood still, the world hanging on the brink of some irreversible truth. You live here?" The officer finally asked, his voice shaky. But Marcus didn't respond. He just stared back, too exhausted, too broken to say another word. Marcus sat on the edge of his plush couch, staring blankly at the open newspaper on the coffee table in front of him. His jaw still ached from the officer's punch the day before, a dull pain that throbbed with every movement. He gingerly touched his lip, still slightly swollen, as flashes of the previous afternoon played over and over in his mind. His phone buzzed incessantly on the table. Calls, texts, social media notifications. The videos of his assault had exploded across the internet overnight, and now, everyone wanted a piece of the story. Friends, journalists, activists, everyone had an opinion, a demand, a question, but all Marcus wanted was quiet. A knock at the door startled him. He stood slowly, hesitating for a moment, before walking over and peeking through the window. It was Greg, his agent. Marcus sighed, knowing there was no avoiding this conversation. He opened the door, and Greg rushed in, eyes wide with concern. "Marcus," he said, almost breathless. "Man, I've been trying to reach you since last night. Are you okay? What the hell happened?" Marcus closed the door behind him, leaning against it for a moment before walking back to the couch. He didn't sit, though. He paced. "Greg, I'm fine," Marcus replied, his voice tired, worn. "It's all over the place, isn't it?" Greg let out a short, sharp laugh. "Yeah, you could say that. It's on every platform. The video has millions of views already. It's a nightmare, man." Marcus stopped pacing, standing still as Greg flipped through the articles on his phone. Headlines screamed back at him. Actor assaulted by police in racially charged incident. Marcus Reed brutally attacked by officer in own home. Another case of police violence caught on camera. "I didn't want this," Marcus muttered, his eyes on the floor. I didn't want all of this attention." Greg put his phone down and looked up at Marcus, his expression softening. "I know, but this isn't something you can just sweep under the rug, man. It's out there now. Everyone's talking about it. You need to respond." "I don't want to respond," Marcus shot back, his frustration finally breaking through. "I moved here to get away from all the noise, Greg, to disappear for a while. And now I'm the face of this. Greg stood up, walking over to him. I get it, Marcus. I really do. But this isn't just about you anymore. This is about what they did to you, what that cop did to you. People are watching because this happens to black men every day. But you have a platform. You have the power to actually make people listen. Marcus clenched his fists, his mind swirling. He knew Greg was right, but the weight of it felt suffocating. The last thing he wanted was to be the next viral headline, the next symbol of racial injustice. But the images of that officer's fist hitting his face, of being thrown to the ground in front of his own home, of being humiliated, they wouldn't leave him. I'm not sure I'm ready for this, Marcus said quietly. To be the voice, to be that guy. Greg looked at him for a long moment before nodding slowly. Look, man, you don't have to decide everything right now, but you do need to think about it. The world's waiting on your next move. Before Marcus could respond, there was another knock at the door. Both men froze, exchanging a quick glance. Marcus hesitated, then walked over, peeking through the window again. It was a reporter, a young black woman, holding a microphone and standing with a cameraman. They hadn't noticed Marcus peering through the blinds yet, but they were persistent, knocking again. Shit, Greg muttered under his breath. They're already here. Marcus stepped back from the door, his heart pounding. I'm not doing this. Not today. Greg moved toward the door, taking control of the situation. I'll get rid of them, he said, opening the door just enough to speak. He's not available for comment right now, Greg said, his voice firm but polite. The reporter leaned forward, her face determined. Can you at least tell us how he's doing? The world saw what happened yesterday, and people are demanding justice. This is bigger than just Marcus. It's about the systemic racism that... He's not ready to speak, all right? Greg interrupted, his tone sharper now. Give him some space. The door shut, and Marcus let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He could feel the pressure closing in from all sides. He couldn't avoid the reality of what was happening. It was on the news, it was online, it was at his doorstep. No matter how much he tried to retreat into himself, the world wasn't going to let this go. Greg turned to him. Look, man, you don't have to do interviews right away, but you need to decide what's next. You can't just sit here and hope it all goes away. You're going to have to fight back. Marcus dropped down onto the couch, rubbing his temples. Fight back? How, Greg? By getting into a public screaming match with a racist cop? By suing the police? None of that's going to change what happened. Greg sat down next to him, his voice softer now. No, but it might stop it from happening again. The silence hung in the air for a long moment. Marcus stared at the wall, thinking about all the black men who had faced worse. Those whose names had become hashtags, whose stories were told in protests and murals, but never got justice. He didn't want to be the next hashtag. But maybe Greg was right. Maybe he couldn't just walk away from this. Maybe this was the fight he had been avoiding his whole life. I'll think about it, Marcus finally said, his voice heavy. Greg nodded. That's all I'm asking. As Greg left, Marcus sat in the dimly lit living room, the hum of the world outside growing louder with each passing minute. Marcus stared at the court summons lying on his kitchen counter, the bold letters blurring in his vision as he read the words over and over. Reed versus Peter Walsh and the city police department. It felt surreal, like the headline of someone else's life, not his own. But here it was, staring back at him, demanding his attention. The decision had been made. He was suing the police for excessive force and racial profiling. It wasn't just about the punch or the humiliation anymore. It was about something bigger, something systemic. And now, whether he liked it or not, Marcus Reed had become a symbol in a much larger fight. His phone buzzed again, and this time, he didn't ignore it. Marcus, we need to go over the strategy again, his lawyer, Dana Lewis, said as soon as he picked up. Dana was sharp, relentless, and one of the best civil rights attorneys in the country. Marcus had hired her after Greg introduced them, and from their first meeting, she made it clear that she wasn't just in this to win the case. She wanted to expose the entire system. Dana, we've been over this 1,000 times, Marcus sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I'm exhausted. I know, she said, her voice softening slightly. But we're up against a department that's been covering for this guy for years. You need to be ready for them to come after you. Hard. Marcus walked over to the window, looking out at the quiet, tree-lined street. It was peaceful, almost idyllic, but he couldn't help feeling that the calm was deceiving. "They're going to try and discredit me," he said flatly, already knowing what was coming. "Exactly," Dana replied. "They've already started leaking things to the press. Old photos of you at parties, rumors about relationships. They're going to paint you as some out-of-control celebrity who thinks he's above the law." Marcus clenched his jaw, the familiar frustration bubbling up again. "Of course they are, but we have the truth on our side," Dana continued, her voice firm. "The footage is undeniable, and we've uncovered records of several complaints against Walsh for racially motivated stops and excessive force. The department ignored every single one." Marcus turned away from the window, leaning back against the wall. "So, what's the plan?" "We go public," Dana said without hesitation. "We hold a press conference. You tell your side of the story, on your terms. We don't let them control the narrative." Marcus paused, thinking it over. He hated the idea of more cameras, more reporters, more questions, but he couldn't deny the impact it would have. Staying silent had never worked for people like him. And now, the world was watching. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's do it." 2 days later, Marcus stood behind a podium in front of a sea of reporters and flashing cameras. The small conference room was packed with journalists, activists, and members of the public, all eager to hear from the man who had, in a matter of days, become the face of a national conversation. Dana stood beside him, flipping through her notes, but Marcus didn't need a script. He had spent days preparing for this moment, going over every detail in his head until it was second nature. Now, all he had to do was speak the truth. He cleared his throat, gripping the edges of the podium. The noise in the room settled to a low hum. Every eye focused on him. "I never wanted to be here," Marcus began, his voice steady, though his heart pounded in his chest. "I never wanted to be the center of this. All I wanted was a home, a place where I could be myself, where I didn't have to be Marcus Reed, the actor, just Marcus. But that's not what happened." He paused, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "On the afternoon of October 12th, I was assaulted by Officer Peter Walsh, right in front of my own home. He didn't ask questions. He didn't check the facts. He looked at me and decided, based on nothing more than the color of my skin, that I didn't belong in that neighborhood." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Marcus didn't stop. "This isn't an isolated incident. What happened to me happens to black men and women across this country every day. The difference is, my assault was caught on camera. But think about all the times it wasn't. Think about all the voices that haven't been heard." Marcus's voice grew stronger, the tension inside him giving way to a fierce resolve. "This isn't just about one bad cop. This is about a system that protects people like him, that ignores the complaints, that looks the other way when someone abuses their power." He glanced at Dana, who nodded subtly, her face unreadable but clearly pleased with how things were going. "I've spent my entire career in the public eye," Marcus continued, "and I know what it's like to be judged by appearances. But this is different. This isn't just about me. It's about all the people who've been told they don't belong, who've been treated like criminals in their own homes, in their own skin." A hand shot up in the crowd, a reporter eager to jump in. Marcus pointed to her. "Mr. Reed, what do you say to those who argue that Officer Walsh made an honest mistake, that he was just doing his job?" Marcus felt a surge of anger rise, but he kept his composure. "An honest mistake," he repeated, his voice steady but cold. "When Officer Walsh punched me in the face and threw me to the ground without asking a single question, that wasn't a mistake. That was violence. That was racism, and it's unacceptable." More questions flew at him, but Marcus kept control, deflecting the ones meant to discredit him and staying focused on the bigger issue. By the end of the press conference, his legs felt like lead, but his spirit was alive with a new sense of purpose. He had been reluctant to step into the spotlight, but now that he was here, there was no turning back. As the crowd began to disperse, Dana stepped closer, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "You killed it, Marcus. They can't spin this. You were clear, powerful. They're going to have a hard time taking you down now." Marcus nodded, but he knew the battle was far from over. He could already feel the coming storm, the media frenzy, the attacks on his character. But for the first time since that day on his doorstep, he felt in control, and he wasn't going to back down. The courtroom was cold, sterile, the kind of place where the weight of decisions hung in the air like fog, thick and suffocating. Marcus sat at the plaintiff's table, his eyes fixed on the polished wood in front of him, trying to block out the noise. The whispers, the shuffling of papers, the constant clicking of keyboards as reporters typed every word spoken. He felt like a specimen under a microscope, every move, every expression scrutinized. Next to him, Dana sat upright, her face calm and unreadable as always. She was prepared, every document meticulously organized, every argument sharpened like a blade. But even she couldn't shake the weight of what they were up against. This was more than just a trial. It felt like a reckoning. The courtroom was filled with spectators, journalists, activists, curious onlookers. Marcus had become the face of this fight, and now everyone wanted to see how it would play out. On the other side of the room, Peter Walsh sat with his lawyer. He looked different than Marcus remembered, smaller, somehow. Not physically, but the confidence, the power that had been in his eyes when he threw that punch was gone. Now he just looked tired. But Marcus wasn't fooled. Behind those tired eyes was still the same man, a man who thought he could get away with what he'd done. Reed versus Walsh. The bailiff called, and the room fell silent as the judge entered. Marcus straightened in his chair, his heartbeat quickening. This was it. Dana wasted no time. She stood and delivered her opening statement with precision, outlining the brutality of the attack, the systemic failures of the police department, and the blatant racial profiling that had led to the incident. Her words were sharp, clear, each one landing like a hammer. This case is not just about Mr. Marcus Reed, she said, her voice ringing through the courtroom. This is about the countless others who have faced similar injustices, the people whose voices have been silenced. It's about holding accountable those who abuse their power and the systems that protect them. The defense, as expected, painted a different picture. Walsh's attorney stood, his voice smooth, practiced. He portrayed Walsh as a man caught in a difficult situation, a police officer who was simply trying to protect the neighborhood. Officer Walsh made a judgment call based on the information he had at the time, he argued. It was a mistake, yes, but not malicious. Marcus clenched his fists under the table, the anger rising in him like a fire. A mistake? That's what they were calling it? The punch, the slamming to the ground, the humiliation, just a mistake? As the trial unfolded, the defense's strategy became clear. They weren't just trying to justify Walsh's actions. They were trying to discredit Marcus. Piece by piece, they brought up his life, twisting every detail to paint him as arrogant, as someone who believed the rules didn't apply to him. They showed photos of him at parties, gossip headlines from tabloids, even pulling in old controversies from his Hollywood past, none of which had anything to do with the case, but were designed to plant a seed of doubt in the jury's minds. They wanted to make it seem like Marcus's fame, his wealth, made him unrelatable, a man who thought he was untouchable. He's used to special treatment, the defense attorney said, his voice dripping with disdain. He's used to doors opening for him just because of who he is. But this time, the law doesn't bend to his will. Marcus stared at the attorney, feeling the heat of 1,000 eyes on him. He could feel the subtle shift in the room, the way people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The defense was doing exactly what they wanted, making him look like the privileged celebrity who couldn't handle being treated like everyone else. Dana shot him a look, a quick signal to stay calm. She knew what was happening too, but she wasn't worried. Not yet. Then came the testimonies. The first to take the stand was a neighbor, one of the few who had recorded the incident. He recounted what he had seen, how Officer Walsh had approached Marcus without any conversation or warning, how Marcus had been knocked to the ground before he could say anything. The video shown in court played again on the screen, the impact of the punch echoing through the room. The silence that followed was heavy. The jury watched the screen, some with wide eyes, others with grim expressions. The footage was raw, undeniable, but the defense wasn't giving up. When Peter Walsh took the stand, he did so with a heavy sigh, as if this entire ordeal was an unfair burden. He tried to sound remorseful, apologetic even. "I thought he was a threat," Walsh said, his voice steady. The way he was at the door, struggling, I thought it was a break-in. I reacted too quickly, and for that, I'm sorry. But I was just doing my job. Dana's eyes narrowed, and when it was her turn to cross-examine, she wasted no time cutting through his excuses. Officer Walsh, she began, her tone ice-cold. You've been a police officer for over 10 years. In that time, how many black men have you stopped on suspicion, only to realize they weren't involved in any crime? Walsh shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I don't have that number. Of course you don't, Dana said, stepping closer. Because it's a pattern, isn't it? A pattern of assumptions based on skin color. You didn't see Marcus Reed as a man moving into his home. You saw him as a threat because that's what you've been trained to see. And you acted on that prejudice, didn't you? I acted on what I thought was a crime in progress. And when you realized you were wrong, instead of apologizing, you tried to cover it up. You tried to paint him as the aggressor. Isn't that right, Officer Walsh? Walsh's face flushed red, his calm demeanor slipping. He didn't answer. The courtroom buzzed with tension. Marcus could feel it, a shift, subtle but there. The jury was listening. They were seeing the truth. As the cross-examination ended, Dana returned to her seat, her expression resolute. We've got him, she whispered to Marcus. But Marcus wasn't celebrating yet. The trial wasn't over, and he knew better than anyone that justice, real justice, was never guaranteed. It wasn't over until the verdict was in, and even then, the fight was far from finished. The courtroom was tense as everyone returned from a brief recess. Marcus sat still, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, waiting for the jury to come back with their verdict. His lawyer, Dana, was beside him, flipping through her notes even though there was nothing more to prepare for. It was out of their hands now. Across the room, Peter Walsh sat with his own lawyer, but his eyes avoided Marcus at every opportunity. The officer's once stoic expression had crumbled over the course of the trial. He no longer looked like the confident man who had punched Marcus in the face without a second thought. The truth had stripped him bare, exposing the bias and hatred he tried to hide behind his badge. The jury filed in slowly, and Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. He had been waiting for this moment for weeks, but now that it was here, the anticipation felt unbearable. Every second felt like it stretched into minutes. All rise. The bailiff's voice cut through the room, and the judge returned to the bench. The quiet shuffle of feet echoed in the silent courtroom as everyone stood, then sat again as the judge took her seat. As the jury reached a verdict, the judge asked, her voice calm, but carrying the weight of the moment. The foreman, a middle-aged woman who had watched Marcus carefully throughout the trial, stood up, holding a piece of paper. She nodded solemnly. We have, Your Honor. Marcus held his breath, his entire body tensing as the paper was handed to the judge. She unfolded it slowly, reading the verdict to herself before looking up at the room. In the matter of Reed versus Walsh, we find the defendant, Peter Walsh, guilty of excessive force, misconduct, and racial discrimination. A collective sigh spread across the room. Marcus felt his chest collapse as if he had been holding in a breath since the incident happened. Dana squeezed his arm gently, her face breaking into a small, victorious smile. They had won, but for Marcus, it didn't feel like a victory yet. Not completely. Walsh's lawyer immediately stood up, already motioning for an appeal. Marcus barely registered the words. His eyes were locked on Walsh, who now looked smaller than ever, hunched in his chair, staring down at the floor like the weight of the verdict had knocked the life out of him. There were no handcuffs, no immediate punishment, just the knowledge that his guilt had been declared in front of the world. And for now, that was enough. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Reporters, activists, supporters, all waiting for the outcome. As Marcus and Dana walked toward the steps, the murmurs turned into applause, cheers, and chants. Justice for Marcus. Black Lives Matter. The words rang out, filling the air like a wave of energy. The sea of people holding signs and banners was overwhelming, but in the best way. Marcus stopped at the top of the steps, looking out over the crowd. Greg was somewhere off to the side, his expression a mix of pride and relief. Marcus's eyes searched for his mother, who had flown in for the trial. She was standing a little apart from the crowd, a soft, proud smile on her face. She hadn't wanted to be in the courtroom, but she had been there every night, waiting for him when he came home, offering quiet support. Dana nudged him, her voice low but encouraging. "This is your moment, Marcus." He took a deep breath, stepping forward to address the crowd. The reporters pushed their microphones closer, the cameras zooming in, but Marcus wasn't thinking about them. He was thinking about the people who had stood by him, the countless others who didn't have this platform, and what it all meant. "I never wanted to be a symbol," he began, his voice steady but carrying the weight of everything he had been through. "I didn't ask for this, but what happened to me wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about a system that allows people like Peter Walsh to abuse their power and never face the consequences." The crowd murmured in agreement, the energy shifting between anger and hope. "I'm grateful for today's verdict," Marcus continued, "but this is just one step. This fight isn't over. It's not over for the people who are targeted every day, who don't have the cameras and the headlines to back them up. We can't stop here. We won't stop here." The applause that followed was deafening, but Marcus barely heard it. He wasn't delivering a victory speech. He was declaring a mission. He had crossed a line from which there was no turning back. As he stepped down from the podium, a reporter called out a question. "What do you hope happens next?" Marcus turned, the weight of the moment still heavy on his shoulders but not crushing him anymore. "I hope," he said, "that this case shows people that it's not about who you are, how famous you are, or how much money you have. Racism, brutality, injustice, they affect all of us. And we can't afford to look away." As Marcus walked through the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging words with people who had followed his case closely, he felt something he hadn't expected: hope. The world hadn't changed overnight. Peter Walsh would likely appeal, and the systemic issues they had fought against were still deeply ingrained. But for the first time, Marcus felt like he was in control of the narrative. He had turned his pain into power, and there was no going back. Months later, Marcus sat on his porch, the same place where everything had started. The neighborhood felt quieter now, but it wasn't the uneasy silence from before. This time, it felt like peace. The media frenzy had died down, the protests had dispersed, but the conversations continued. Marcus had kept his promise, speaking at rallies, giving interviews, using his platform to push for change. He wasn't just an actor anymore. He was an advocate, a fighter, and most importantly, a voice for the people who hadn't been heard. His phone buzzed with a text from Greg. "You're on the front page again. People are listening." Marcus smiled faintly, putting the phone down. He had come to this neighborhood for privacy, for a quiet life. But what he had found was purpose. And this, he realized, was the beginning of something far bigger than himself.